So this commentary is a preliminary note, neither a fully developed paper nor a complete draft. Rather, it is based on observations of Turkish elections, particularly since the Gezi protests in 2013. It offers a critical perspective on the formation of opposition coalitions which have emerged in an effort to challenge the 2-decade-long rule of the Justice and Development Party, AKP. While grounded in the specific political and historical context of Turkey, I believe the critique of how these coalitions are formed and their consequences for a possibility of a change toward democracy resonates beyond Turkey, highlighting the challenges common to other authoritarian settings. Elections in authoritarian contexts are not an easy matter to explain. Why do authoritarian rulers continue to hold elections? Would elections in these contexts really matter? Are they simply a stage or a facade, merely functions for the acclamation of the ruling party without any possibility for a real change? Or, no matter how controlled or manipulated they are, elections still constitute a risk for an incumbent autocrat to lose political power? Although these questions require more complicated research on elections in authoritarian regimes, it is fair to say, at least, that the elections constitute, at the same time, an opportunity and a risk for a democratic possibility. Despite all obstacles, elections still offer an opportunity for nonviolent political change. Opposition, in a wider sense, can come together to use this opportunity to defeat the autocrat in the ballot box. Elections, on the other hand, harbor a risk as well. If an incumbent autocrat wins the elections, he would claim that the results mean public approval and support for what he has done so far, and a mandate to deepen the authoritarian measures and control. For an autocrat, an election, as long as he comes as the winner, would be the best way to renew its legitimacy, figure out whom to suppress, how to reallocate resources with a clientelistic purpose, and fix the weaknesses of his rule. While acknowledging that against all odds, elections remain an important avenue for potential power change, opposition parties play a crucial role in organizing resistance against autocratic rule. Unlike civil society actors and other dissenting groups, political parties are harder for authoritarian governments to delegitimize and criminalize. While political dissent, protests, and boycotts may persist in authoritarian contexts, the path to gaining political power via elections still requires political parties. Needless to say, it is difficult to defeat the incumbent in an authoritarian context. Elections are not free and fair, to say the least. It is not only the executive power that the ruling party controls. Institutions that are supposed to ensure the security and integrity of an election and monitor the process are no longer independent and cannot be trusted. The media, captured by the ruling party, become an instrument for misinformation and manipulation. Society and politics are highly polarized, which makes it difficult to reach cross-party voters. And most importantly, autocratic incumbent came to power through elections and generally retains a significant level of popular support. In these uneven conditions and severe obstacles during the elections for opposition parties, it is generally underlined that the only way for the opposition to defeat the incumbent autocrat is to form a pre-election coalition, that the opposition parties should unite in the election against the autocratic ruler. Such an alliance would constitute a stronger opponent, difficult to suppress, and could prevent a division among the opposition voters. Although a pre-election opposition alliance could be the best hope for an electoral victory against the incumbent, forming such an alliance and sustaining it until the election is not easy and is based on a fragile balance among members of such an alliance. Among other things, many scholars underlined the importance of compromise among the members of an opposition coalition. Being against the autocratic ruling party and its leader could be the only common point the members of this alliance share. A united front against the ruler is supposed to bring parties with significant ideological differences and policy choices together. Generally, the terms of the trade-off needed for the formation of a pre-election opposition alliance is defined as one of between democracy and ideological positions. Are the parties and their voters willing to support democracy, even if it would mean putting their ideological goals aside? The choice, in other words, is between defeating the autocratic incumbent to bring democracy back, or insisting on ideological positions or policy preferences at the expense of transition to democracy. Would the opposition parties and their voters put their particular policy preferences aside to restore democracy? The problem in this formulation of the trade-off is that it equates the defeat of an incumbent autocrat with the restoration of democracy. What if the choice is posed differently, that the trade-off is not the one between ideological hardlines or democracy, but between demand for a democratic regime or political transition? What if political transition at the ballot box that would take political power away from the autocrat does not necessarily mean a transition to democracy? Should the voters who demand democracy put their demands aside and committed to an opposition alliance that might be the only winning option against a sitting autocrat, yet also an option that could replace one autocrat with another? One of the authoritarian contexts that complicate the relation between pre-election coalitions, defeating autocratic rule, and democratic restoration is Turkey. Today, Turkey, under the rule of Justice and Development Party and its leader Erdoğan, has been considered one of the examples of an autocratic decline of democratic institutions and the rule of law, starting its political tenure in 2002 with a promise of democratic reforms. The AKP and Erdoğan became architects of an authoritarian regime with severe records of human rights violations and a decline in the rule of law 2 decades after their first electoral victory. In examining the pre-election opposition coalitions formed in Turkey over the years to achieve political powers change, I aim to develop a critical analysis of what these coalitions are truly about. How are these coalitions or electoral alliances explained or justified to both the parties involved and the voters? What is the discrepancy between the main narrative behind their justification and how they are actually realized? And what are the broader political consequences of these coalitions, particularly in terms of the potential for democratic change, even when they fail to unseat the incumbent? My goal is to expand this initial commentary into a more comprehensive analysis by examining various Turkish elections, but for now, I will focus on the 2023 presidential and parliamentary elections and simply put a couple of critical points instead of a full developed analysis. For some, the 2023 presidential and parliamentary elections were an opportunity to gain political power from Erdoğan and the AKP, as the elections was thought to be a real possibility to finally defeat him. For some observers of Turkish politics, the economic downfall, increasing political pressure in every sector of the society, refugee crisis, the rifts inside the party were some of the reasons that made his defeat likely in 2023. Similar to previous elections, different people from politics to universities and civil society organizations underlined that the only thing needed was a pre-election alliance against the AKP. And the needed pre-election coalition seems also on the horizon, with the opposition alliance called the Table of Six. The search for such an alliance against Erdoğan started with the initiation of Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the then leader of the main opposition party, and almost a year before the elections, the six oppositional parties tried to reach a consensus about the election strategies, the name of the presidential candidate of the opposition, and the blueprints of the post-Erdoğan reforms. Although these parties were far from reaching a consensus on these matters, one thing they all agree on was the need to return to parliamentarism, that the presidential regime was the final blow to the remnants of a system of checks and balances and independent institutions. In addition to the Republican People's Party, the main opposition party, more, as they claim, center-left and with social democratic leanings, the Table of Six had Nationalist Good Party, the center-right Democrat Party, the Islamist Felicity Party, the Future Party of the former Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, and the Democracy and Progress Party of the former former Minister of Economics and Foreign Affairs Ali Babacan. Long story short, this coalition had many difficulties along the way and lost the elections. I would like to underline two issues in relation to the so-called Table of Six pre-election coalition. These two issues were also relevant to previous attempts to form a pre-election coalition in Turkey against the AKP. The question was not about whether these parties would be able to put their ideological differences aside and give up their ideological positions for the sake of democratic restoration, but whether these were the parties that could be behind such a restoration at all. Their track record in politics and also in the opposition coalition meetings indicate otherwise, that they had failed to make such compromises, that their commitment to democracy is at least dubious. Then the question was, if they succeeded to form an anti-Erdogan pre-election alliance, yet without a sincere commitment to democratic values and principles, should those who suffered the most under autocratic regime support the alliance anyways? The main narrative used to justify the Table of Six coalition was that it was the only option that could gain enough electoral support to defeat Erdogan. With the members from the right, Islamist, conservative, nationalist, such a coalition could even get votes from the AKP's constituency. Anything that would jeopardize the formation of this coalition would mean the continuity of autocratic rule. This argument appeared previously during the 2014 presidential elections. At that time, the coalition against Erdogan decided to go with a conservative nationalist candidate. Against all criticisms that the candidate was a kind of insult to those who resisted the increasingly authoritarian rule, it was said that the voters would not support a left or progressive candidate. This is the pragmatic option with the possibility of winning against Erdogan. The same argument of there is no alternative to joining forces with parties and politicians whose past deeds have been conservative, ultra-nationalist, Islamist, exclusionary, was always put forward to those who questioned the democratic credentials of these coalitions. The leaders of the two parties in the Table of Six coalition were part of the AKP and very much contributed to autocratization. Davutoğlu was the prime minister during a very dark chapter in Turkish history, when terror attacks following the June 2015 elections were targeting Kurdish communities and leftist political actors. Davutoğlu saw these attacks as an opportunity to reminding the people that they should understand what would happen when they won't vote for the AKP. The Nationalist Good Party and the Islamist Felicity Party accepted to sit around the table with one red line, that they cannot accept the crossover. The Kurds should not be in the coalition. Expecting a democratic restoration from these parties was a bit too optimistic, given their past and present attitudes to ethnic and religious minorities, gender identities, and many other problems that democratic politics is hoped to be a solution to. Similar to the previous cases, and I'm going to develop this point a bit further, but the opposition coalitions were always based on the compromises demanded from the more progressive political actors, particularly democratic left. Those who think that there is no alternative to the coalition of the Table of Six claimed that their commitment to a return to a parliamentarism was the necessary and sufficient condition to believe in their commitment to democracy. Once we achieve to restore parliamentarism in Turkey, they argue, we will have the necessary free and democratic context where we can bring issues that cannot be brought up before the election for the sake of alliance. Yet this argument was very similar to one we heard in the early 2000s, especially during the 2010 constitutional amendment process. At the time, the AKP and its supporters, including liberal intellectuals, argued that the defining problem of Turkish democracy was the military tutelage. It was not the time to discuss the AKP and Erdogan's democratic credentials. We have to unite behind them for a civilianization of politics in Turkey against the authoritarian establishment. Democracy will surely follow. But it did not. 2 decades of AKP rule have shown that civilianization might not be a necessary condition for democratic politics, but it is not a sufficient one. And putting aside substantial questions on democracy and the questions about the democratic commitments of parties is not a good strategy. Before 2023 elections, the same inevitable choice was put forward. Yes, the people around the opposition alliance might not have very bright political records and might have at least questionable commitments to democratic values, but there is no alternative. Such a coalition might not be talking about the decade-long political problems. They might not include Kurds, the women's movement, students resisting the government's measures to protect their universities, or academicians and journalists who were purged from their institutions since they defend democratic rights and their professional integrity. A coalition of lesser evil is the only option. The assumption behind the politics of the lesser evil is that a political movement or demand who gives priority to a democratic system for all, that is ready to propose a genuine democratic solution to ongoing issues, is destined to lose, since it upsets the voters with nationalist, religious, conservative, heterosexual, or masculine sensitivities. And it is claimed that the overwhelming majority of the electorate is nationalist conservative, that the burden of compromise, of giving up on insisting for a more egalitarian democratic possibilities, lies always on the democratic left in the society. Those who have been suffering the most from increasing political pressure, inequality, and exclusion, those who demanded the realization of the democratic promise for an egalitarian and free society, have to put such demands to rest and have to accept the option of the lesser evil. The center-right, the right-wing parties in all previous experiences of opposition alliances were never asked to make a compromise of their ideological positions for the sake of democracy. On the contrary, the only way to win over the autocratic ruler requires, as it has been claimed, those who struggle and demand a democratic society to make a choice between their commitments to democracy, freedom, equality, or winning an election. For a possible success of a pre-election opposition coalition, it is more than their silence about the right-wing opposition of the parties, silence of the left-wing parties on the table that demanded from democratic left. Their intense labor, so to speak, is needed. Here, well, I didn't develop much here, but the idea that we need to understand is that despite this pressure on the democratic left, that they practically shut up until winning the election, is not the only demand the coalition requires, because they are the ones that working during the election process to make the system work. They are the ones that they voluntarily wait during the voting process, during the counting process, so that the election will not be even further suppressed and manipulated. So their commitment and active work during the election is needed, but they cannot bring their demands to the table. So I just, imagine a couple of assumptions that this coalition or the lesser evilism has, and I'll finish. The constituency is overwhelmingly nationalist. That's one assumption, that this is a fact that cannot change. We simply have to accept this as a fact of politics in Turkey and develop our strategy based on this assumption. In order to win the majority vote, the opposition coalition has to formulate their electoral campaign in line with these sensibilities. The idea has always been that it is less politically costly to exclude democratic forces, democratic left, and their demands than to join forces with undemocratic political actors in a so-called pre-election opposition, with the assumption that the voters are generally conservative, nationalists, and committed to one of the shades of the right-wing politics. Second, those political actors who demand more egalitarian and democratic solutions are the ones who are in need or dependent to such coalition. The right-wing parties on the table can swing from opposition to government, to power. Compromise has to be made to keep them on the coalition. If you want to get rid of the existing autocratic government, there is no alternative for you. This is what democratic left has been told. Third, the idea that there is no alternative other than the lesser evil, that the democratic demands should be left to after electoral victory, does not necessarily lead to democracy. Political change might very much bring another authoritarian power. The effects of such lesser evilism go beyond jeopardizing a possible democratic future. They have profound consequences for the politics of the present. Building political strategies on the premise that the right-wing sensibilities must not be agitated by raising democratic demands inevitably results in an alignment with the right-wing agenda. This approach not only sidelines more progressive or left positions, but also normalizes the discourse and priorities of the right-wing actors, allowing them to dominate the political narrative about the country's social and political problems. Over time, this leads to the adoption of their framing of key issues such as national identity, security, migration, economic challenges as the default framework for political debate. This dynamic reinforces the right-wing actors' legitimacy and their discursive authority, making it harder for democratic forces to contest or reshape the political agenda. Ultimately, it is not just that the right-wing discourse becomes dominant, but that it becomes the unchallenged lens through which political reality is constructed, further entrenching authoritarian practices that the coalition is supposed to overthrow. And this kind of radicalization of the right or the right-wing agenda becomes normal, and then everybody somehow needs to make right-wing actors happy or address their concerns in one way or another, is not limited to authoritarian context that we're seeing in Germany to United States, I think. The electoral campaign, for instance, during 2023, all the political maneuvers of the parties on the table of six led to small far-right, even fascist parties became what they called themselves kingmakers. That we started the discussion in 2023 about a change to parliamentarism, and we end up with discussing how to send Syrians back. And it becomes a pissing context among the coalition members, how to protect or who best protects the traditional Turkish family values. The argument for the lesser evil and the assumptions it is based on has many problems, but I would like to mention one related, as the last point, to the role of political parties as a concluding remark. This argument overlooks the role of parties in their capacity to change and transform political opinions and positions, structure political frontiers, and contribute to the formation of a democratic subject. On the contrary, political parties are not simply and passively mirror political choices existing in society that cannot change. They can create a political narrative that shows what is at stake if the autocratic incumbent wins again and what is needed to live in a democratic society. Oppositions, especially in authoritarian contexts, should have a long-term trajectory with the aim of the formation of a body of voters that will support democratic restoration without compromises with the undemocratic forces. In Turkish case, however, the opposition is short-sighted, thinking that the only way to defeat Erdogan is to be a kind of ideological imposter. Otherwise, from extreme to center, right-wing political voters would be upset. Long-term interaction between the democratic resistance movements and opposition parties is required so that both sides of this interaction could change. Parties can learn to listen and respond to democratic demands instead of silencing or overlooking them, based on the argument that it is not realistic today to demand more. Parties would be seen less as alienated, elite-driven, or even oligarchic institutions, and voters can understand over time that they have to compromise and should be open to discussing the issues that they consider unquestionable. Contrary to many studies on elections in authoritarian context, the trade-off between ideological positions on the one hand and democracy on the other is not given. And political parties in opposition with genuine commitment to democratic restoration have a responsibility in presenting a trade-off in that way. An autocratic regime that was not built overnight won't go down without a long-term struggle and preparation. It is more than a matter of electoral campaign to take the autocratic system down.
Thank you, Ertuğ. That was really very informative. It seems to me that you're pointing to two issues. One is general about democracy in pluralistic or deeply pluralistic societies, and the other is the specific Turkish context, which I don't know very well. So let me just comment very quickly on the first one. So among the many rhetorical infelicities I committed in my presentation apparently was to say that Schmidt is used for nothing, but actually he's quite useful for analyzing the situation you described, right? The problem is that in a society that has quite a span of different views and opinions, some of which perhaps are even incompatible, of forming alliances and coalitions or even making any parliamentary system work is very, very difficult. Schmidt would postulate impossible, right? And so there goes his nationalism, which requires homogeneity, equality, whatever I presented. And it seems to me that it really is a challenging task. It's a question. For me, it's really a question. Is it possible? And what you are reporting suggests that, well, if it's possible, then it's a really very tall order. And then the practical question about the specific Turkish context, I wonder whether, because it seems like you want to inform the opposition how to do better next time, right? You're not only analyzing, you want to produce some kind of policy recommendation for the next elections, and it seems like partly what the progressive parties are doing are being bad negotiators, right? If their vote or if their participation is indispensable for coalition, then they should weaponize that, capitalize that, and be better at the next table of six or whatever it is. But if they get to be persuaded by the arguments that the only viable politics, and that may be actually true, it's hard to know, right, is a politics of anti-immigrants, of hard right, which is a situation look at Austria, right? I mean, many countries are today. Then I don't know how a progressive movement should deal with that. But that's also a fascinating question, returning back to Schmidt. So that was what I had to say. Thank you.
You can answer right away.
Okay. I think, of course, there are reasons why the main opposition party in Turkey is so inclined easily to appropriate some otherwise nationalist and conservative ideas. So why the table of six is not as horrible as it is to me, to them. So that is a very, long political history of it, behind it. But the thing is, even in Turkey, when I see, is that the only time when Erdogan lost the majority enough to build a one-party government in Turkey was 2015 June elections. This is the only one when actually the coalition building among the oppositional forces, led by Selahattin Demirtas, the leader of the Kurdish party back then, instead of the CHP. He did it for the CHP, but with a very loaded democratic agenda, saying that, look, this is what you need to do. But the thing is, and it achieved. So this assumption, I have a problem behind the coalition, that as if the society really right-wing, and they never understand if someone comes and put the dilemma or the choice differently, that, look, if you don't want to sit around the table with the Kurds, if you don't want to question your traditional family values and so on and so forth, then enjoy Erdogan. Go ahead. But if you don't, then you have to sit around the table, not with these quasi-fascist Islamist parties, but with the democratic forces, mostly developed as voluntary initiatives and everything after the Gezi event. Those forces never find themselves a body, so to speak, that they can be represented. So my problem is about the presentation of the choice as a lesser evil, and then the democratic forces has to just stay silent and accept. And I agree in terms of, I think you catch there, I don't know if it's a policy recommendation, but interestingly, the very shorter and first version of this paper was before the election. So while I'm writing this one, I made all of them as a past tense. Because of the kind of a piece that comes from the angers that I vote for this coalition with my vote most of the time is a kind of a vote that I'm going to vote this again. Like this, why it is me that I have to accept these people. I don't know if I had just.
I mean, thank you very much. It was very informative and very interesting. And one of the things that it made me think about is, whether elections in the democratic setting and elections in the authoritarian setting, whether they don't actually follow different logics. Assuming that the elections in democratic settings are about, aggregation of preferences and then somehow making sure that the representative body somehow mirrors in an aggregated way the preferences of the social level, right? It seems to me that elections in the authoritarian setting are more like a plebiscite, right? Which is either for or against, and when you have this much more binary logic of the election, then it is kind of understandable that you are basically forced to choose between two options, right? Not more. And then those who have more, stakes in actually transitioning to democracy or ousting the authoritarian might also feel that they have more, that they kind of need to give up more of their demands, right? Which obviously is not necessarily a legitimate way or politically wise way of thinking, but I was wondering if this kind of factors in, right? Or maybe there is the tension between those two logics of how elections work.
I think exactly that's the point that I'm trying to make, is that making the elections as a kind of an existential issue is needed. That I'm not sure if I am inclined towards a kind of Laclau's anti-establishment front that everyone starts to share
Like populism
a
logic.
position, a frontier, not because they share something, they might have different demands, but this negation is the only way to unite the democratic front. That I think that's the only way, because the autocrat always also make the elections as a plebiscite. We never talk about, for instance, hey, what about your, retirement policies or tax reforms? What is your education policy? I never, at least since 2008 maybe, I never heard such kind of a discussion in Turkey. We're going to die if we don't vote for Erdogan. Or the other party says we're going to live in a tyrannical order if we continue to have him. This is also him putting the plebiscite in front of us. And I think we have to capture this plebiscite. But the only way to make this kind of electoral fight a building block towards democracy is not to delay or asking democratic left not to be radical, or not just, please, can you not piss off the fascists, but to say that no, this is it. I was ready to lose all the elections that I lost, but in a different way. At least every loss could be a point to construct a winning political subjectivity. Instead, we contribute the development of a right-wing agenda that everybody thinks that society is bad because of Syrians, and then we have a problem about gays and lesbians, and the family is in danger. That's what I think I'm trying to get, instead of thinking like policy level.
Okay, right in the beginning of the conference, I was mentioning precisely this point by Gregory Yudin when he said that the reason why autocracies and democracies do not differ for him is that in both cases they are plebiscite. And you are saying that this condition is still really important. So now in Georgia, we have a crucial condition when the extreme autocracy is awaiting the elections. The opposition is extremely strong, and the numbers of the plebiscite can be provided by the autocracy. So the conceptual difference here is that I don't agree with Yudin at all. I mean, the question is not that in both cases we have plebiscite, but the condition is that in case of informal autocracy, and Georgia is ruled by informal oligarch, which doesn't have any position whatsoever, and still he is the main principal figure who defines the whole legislation. So it's a classical Schmittian sovereign. But that he can organize this plebiscite. Like Putin, when he changed constitution, he simply staged it as a theatrical thing. So let's not believe and trust that plebiscite is so bad and that it's a tyranny of people, right? If the tyranny of people decides about something, okay, we consent. But the problem of autocracy is not that. The problem of autocracy is this condition of falsification and abusing abusing the power in terms of taking the right to falsify, which I think is still impossible in democratic conditions. Maybe I'm an idealist, but I believe in it.
You mentioned this in passing, I think US and Germany, because lesser evilism is also a concept that's usually being discussed with US elections. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on like the similarities that, because you said it could be applied to your analysis, can shed light on different situations.
I try to be careful there. Not the entire idea, yes, so, always voting someone in US because she is not Trump is not a healthy choice. Or we are, supporting a party because it is not of AfD, is not healthy for democratic society. So it seems to be, for a very long time, we are, trying to vote along those lines in different contexts. My very, I think, humble comment about democratic context is not necessarily the whole lesser evilism I tried to mention, but what I'm trying to underline, what happened in this lesser evilism in Turkish context, is not, it is just like we bringing otherwise undemocratic actors together and relying on that if they win the election, maybe they will bring democracy, or, they don't have any commitments to it, but what if? Even this, by the way, could be demanded by someone. Just imagine that you are choked by my right hand for so long, and I am tired, and I try to replace my right hand to choke you with my left hand. And in between, you have just one moment to take a big, deep breath. And this could be very important so that we from one autocrat to another autocrat. Maybe you need this transition to just one time. I don't know. But my point is that, instead of this complicating the future democratic possibility, with this kind of a choice given to democratic left, saying that you have to be silent against the democratic right, is not only about the future, but it makes the entire political agenda determined by the right-wing actors. In that sense, maybe this is not how it happened. That's my point with Germany or US or any other democratic society today, is that by, I don't know, because of the way that the populism becomes the unconditional enemy of democracy or whatever it is, but everyone, everywhere, right parties, center-right parties seems to responding to right-wing agenda and try to change their discourse accordingly. Maybe they don't win, but it is very difficult not to see that the AfD is so far very successful, and now they're saying that, 5 years ago what we were saying, now you're saying in the government about the migrants and then large sandbags and everything. So that's all our idea 5 years ago, and you were freaked out. Now you are appropriating it. So that is kind of a colonization of the political agenda by the right instead of populism could be the thing that we might attention. But how these become an issue, indeed, they are absolutely different reasons and different ways.
I have a question. I know it's late, but so we are closing soon. Yeah, it's mainly to Ertuğ. Isn't there a reason why people might want authoritarianism? Like you are saying, there is a plebiscite in a way. Maybe it's just better. And it's my question to Katie too. I mean, I apologize very deeply for inadvertently offending you. It's been a long day, but it's because I deeply disagree with you. Because again, you present it again as the liberal democracies which are good, and then these autocracies literally when there is a czar. And they are bad, so because they oppress people or support the poor people and oppress intelligentsia. So, I mean, there is something to this. But why? Maybe there is a reason why authoritarianism is simply efficient and is chosen by these countries very consciously and by the populations of these countries for reasons that have international geopolitical character. Just maybe it's too much, but at least this is a possible a devil's advocate hypothesis.
I have just a short comment. For example, El Salvador, the good dictator.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Can I respond to this maybe very briefly? provocation, I had similar frustrations with celebrating popular power, revolutionary insurgency, and people on the street, and how great is that, and why don't we have more on that? But we assume that people want that, right? We assume that people want to be active citizens, really involved, exercising power, constantly working in committees, coming into assemblies, discussing until what time is it, right? And that's what everyone should naturally want. But I think this is where Tocqueville's original diagnosis and critique of individualism that, again, Schmidt appropriates, is that it's actually not what democratic citizens want. And the more equal we become, the less, and that's a shortcut for a longer analysis, but the motivation to actually put in the effort and the time of civic engagement and public action is reduced. So many people prefer to put on the TV or whatever the latest technology, entertainment technology is.
I want to be free to say my word, and I don't want to be arrested after I share some posts via Facebook. So I want to participate, and this is not it.
No, I agree. Me too.
We do, but
right,
you know, there are many people.
But how many are we? Right. I guess.
Yeah, I
that is
agree
my
with
question.
them. Yeah.
I think it's a wrong question because it treats those people who need alliance with the autocratic power as if it's a natural condition. No, this condition is a hard work. So Putinism, for instance, and the condition to which he brought populations was a long and a gradual transformation of the sociality. But at the same time, of course, there is the fault. I mean, there is the fault of the liberal democracy and its inability of social continuity with the, I don't know, unprivileged layers or whatever. And this is also the fault of left-leaning politics, because left-leaning politics was always in cognitive rhetoric, in cognitive creative production, and not in real politics. And the real politics is the war between liberal democracy and autocracy we have to deal with. Because we got rid of communism, right? And you said it's bad. Andreas said it's terrible because it's dictatorship. Now what remains? I mean, no. Yeah, so what remains? Liberal democracy and autocracy, and the tension between these. Because we ourselves, we denied Bolshevism. And what remains? Menshevism. And Menshevism is either social democracy or liberal democracy.
All right. That was serious, but I cannot say anything.
Okay. Yeah, but you have a different. Okay.
I like it like it is animated a little bit.
Okay, so we have, so you, from the Soviet Union and the entire Eastern Bloc, you have the experience of, like, being really, like, oppressed, but at least me and maybe Gregor not, but, so, I think there are two possible democratic systems. One is parliamentary, the other is delegate system, assembly system. They are different systems. And each of them can turn into totalitarianism. Each of them. We saw Hitler, Stalin, for example. So it is not, on the one hand, liberal democracy, parliamentary system, and autocracy. It is two different systems, and each can be autocratic, and Yugoslavia, to a certain extent, was democratic. But it was assembly system, and it was not. It was one party for some time, but it was also multi-party for the first 10 years.
All right.
Can I just just maybe the last my thoughts, and now I try to be careful what I'm going to say now in terms of this debate, because I learned Schmidt and dictatorship from Andreas, and I don't want to be wrong in this interpretation. But I thought the people cannot will for autocracy. They might will for dictatorship in the Schmittian sense. If the dictator represents the will of the people, then I might be happy with that representation. But the autocracy must be a reason to be considered as an autocrat, meaning there must be a significant suppression over the society. So if, in Turkish case, for instance, if the people basically want autocrats, why autocrats become an autocrat? Why he needs to manipulate the elections? Everybody wants, right? So then only a minority is suppressed, and the autocracy is only an autocracy for a minority. If majority wants the autocracy, then that regime cannot be considered as an autocracy. It's an oxymoron because people want it. So, and second is that it is a bit, at least in the case that I'm discussing, that every historical context from Gezi to 2015 elections and even before, people, even voters for the AKP, responded democratic expansions affirmatively. And then, the more Erdogan lost the political popular support, the more autocratic it became. So again, this is, I think, a bit difficult to say that people can want autocracy and still it could be considered as autocracy.